Good morning everyone. This is the module 2 and over here we're going to look at environmentalism, the various trends and also the environmental movement in the north and in south. So when I say the south, it is the global south and the global north. So in other words, we'll also be looking at the environmentalism in the north and south. So today in this particular lecture we are going to focus more on how there is a transition and shift in terms of the very notion of environmentalism, what were the kind of focus, and then and how does the idea of this or notion of environmentalism has evolved over a period of time, and what are the kind of environmental concerns which had been posited, and at the same time what are the political and other aspects which have led to the formations of or the notion of different kinds of laws which have been passed by different states. Now, if you looked at the slide, environmentalism, which of course looked at the political and ethical movement that seeks to improve and protect the quality of the natural environment through changes to environmentally harmful human activities, through the adoptions of forms of political, economic and social organization that are thought to be necessary for at least conducive to the benign treatment of the environment by humans, and then through a reassessment of humanities' relationship with nature. Now, in various ways, environmentalism claims that living things other than humans and the natural environment as a whole are deserving of consideration in reasoning about the morality of political, economic and social policies. Now, one can also look at the various focus which is primarily done in environmentalism, and then what are the intellectual underpinnings of developing this environmental thought. So environmental thought or the very definitions which is given by the Britannica, environmental thought and the various branches of the environmental movement are often classified into two intellectual camps, those that are considered anthropocentric or human-centered, and in orientations and those considered biocentric or life-centered. So this division has been described in other terminology as shallow ecology versus deep ecology, and as technocentrism versus ecocentrism. So we'll be dealing with the deeper details about the environmental ethics in the later part of the course on a different sections by taking into social ecology, deep ecology, so and so forth, and then we will be able to know the various nuances, differences between all these. Now, we should also be familiar with the terminology called anthropocentrism. Now, if you look at the works of Aldo Leopold and Lynn White, they have been pretty much engaged in looking at some of the environmental obsession or the kind of you know, preservation, conservation, or maybe let's say the wilderness thinking, which was a great obsession for many of the, you know, environmentalism in the north and specific to America. Now, anthropocentrism or an anthropocentric approach focus mainly on the negative effects of the environmental degradations which has on the human beings, and their interest include their interest primarily in health, recreation and quality of life. So it is often characterized by a mechanistic approach to the non-human nature, in which individual creatures and species have only an instrumental values for humans. So one should keep in mind that what are the, you know, primary focus of anthropocentrism or anthropocentric approaches. The defining features of anthropocentrism is that it considers the moral obligations humans have to the environment to derive from obligations that humans have to each other and and less crucially to future generations of humans, rather than from any obligations to other living things or to the environment as a whole. So in some sense, human obligations to the environment are thus indirect. Now moving on, we can also further, you know, look at some of the critics of anthropocentrism have argued that it amounts to a form of human chauvinism, and they argue that anthropocentric approaches presuppose the historically Western view of nature as merely as a resource to be managed or exploited for human purposes, a view which they claim is responsible for centuries of environmental destruction. Now, in contrast to anthropocentrism, biocentrism claims that nature has an intrinsic moral value or worth that does not depend on its usefulness to human beings. And it is this intrinsic worth that gives rise directly to the obligations to the environment. Humans are therefore morally bound to protect the environment, as well as individual creatures and species for their own sake. So in this sense, one can defines that the biocentrics view human beings and other elements of the natural environment, both living and often non-living, as members of a single moral and ecological community. Okay, so which means there's no boundary or binary which is being created between the living and non-living. So therefore, biocentrism, ethical perspective, holding that all life deserve equal and equal moral considerations or has equal moral standing. Although elements of biocentrism can be found in several religious traditions, it was not until the late decades of the 20th century that philosophical ethics in the Western tradition addressed the topic in a systematic manner. So By the 1960s and 70s, as scientific knowledge of the causes and consequences of environmental degradation was becoming more extensive and sophisticated, there was increasing concern among some scientists, intellectuals and activists about Earth's ability to absorb the detritus of human activity and indeed to sustain human life. Now, as you can see in the slide, the period that is the post 1960s, from 1960s onward is pretty much important for the simple reason that new environmentalism has emerged. And prior to the 1960s, environmentalism focused on preservations of wilderness and conservations of resources. Now, there was this idea of preservations and conservations of resources for the utilizations of human to serve their purposes. Now, the 60s and 70s, as the scientific knowledge of the causes and consequences of environmental degradation has led to the emergence of a new arts and increasing awareness about the which concern to contribute to the growth of grassroots environmental activism in a number of countries. Therefore, the establishment of new environmental non-governmental organizations and also the formation of environmental, for example, the green political parties in a number of Western democracies. And as we had highlighted and talked about the biocentric and the anthropocentric view, the divisions between these two approaches actually played a central role in the development of the environmental thought in the late 20th century. Now, as I mentioned, we will further looked at the idea of this notion of environmentalism or biocentric and anthropocentric approaches in the later part of our discussion. Now, why is it that there is an urgent need for the environmental movement or a new form of environmentalism, and what perhaps is responsible, and what are the intellectual inputs at that period of time, and then why was there is an increasing awareness in terms of a new concern for the environment. So the environmental movement which flourished way back in 1960s were actually in the midst of like the civil rights movement, peace and women's movements as well. Now, it is interesting to look at again why there is a shift. So prior to looking at the idea which is posited by some of the thinkers of that time, it is important for us also to look at that the new environmental of the 1960s, which focuses on political activism, was largely aimed at legislations and regulations concerning the consumption of nature, and this was prior to the 1960s, and several major shifts actually occur in the 1960s, all of which involve an awareness of the ties between environmental and social problems. Now, towards the new shift of environmentalism, that is the growing concern for environmental gradations. First, with the rapid expansions of the use of, for example, chemicals in the post-World War II period, and of course the publications of Rachel Carson's The Silent Spring, and there was a new emphasis on environmental degradation, especially pollution, and as well as the relationship of to human health. So this in some sense lead to an intensifying call for government to regulate industry more closely, and it also involves an increased awareness of direct relationship between environmental problems and human society. Now, the book The Silent Spring, which was published way back in 1962 by the American biologist and conservationist Rachel Carson's, brought to the public attention the dangers of environmental pollution to public health, such as the use of DDT, dichlorodiphényl trichloroethane, was excessively used, and which of course sparked the beginning of modern environmentalism. Now, in this period, more nature writers began to speak more of environmental problems in addition to the appreciations of nature's beauty. Now, if we further looked at the contributions of Rachel Carson, who was pretty much instrumental and brought a path breaking in terms of giving a new thoughts to environmental movement. Now, as I had pointed out, Rachel Carson, who is an American biologist and also a conservationist, whose book The Silent Spring was actually credited for advancing the global environmental movement. And this particular book, Silent Spring, is considered to have started the global grassroots environmental movement, and it focuses on the negative effect of chemical pesticides that were at that time a large part of which was pretty much extensively used in the US in agriculture. So Rachel Carson and her work began initiating a shift in global environmental consciousness. Now, one of the overarching theme of the Silent Spring is the powerful and often negative effect humans have on the natural world. Now, Carson's main argument is that pesticides have detrimental effects on the environment, and she says that these are more properly termed biocides because their effects are rarely limited to the target pest. Now, another argument or Carson's thesis throughout the Silent Spring was that pesticides and chemicals used to kill pests on crops, and it again bleed onto the environment and affect many of the the water sources. So these chemicals are involuntarily ingested by larger creatures when they eat poisoned insects. Now, Silent Spring in a way presents a view of nature compromised by synthetic pesticides, especially the use of DDT. Now, once these pesticides enter the biosphere, Carson argued that they not only killed bugs but also made their way into the food chain to threaten the bird and also the fish populations, and could eventually sicken the human populace, and more importantly, the children are more prone to this. Now, no doubt, Silent Spring has an impact, and it was met with a fierce opposition by many of the chemical companies, but it spurred a reversal in the national pesticide policy and led to a nationwide ban on DDT for agriculture uses, and also inspired many of the environmental movement that led to the creation of the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency. Now, let's further look at what DDT is. Now, if you look at DDT and bioaccumulation, what is DDT and what is bioaccumulation? DDT was developed as the first modern synthetic insecticides in the 1940s, and it was initially used with great effect to combat sickness such as malaria, typhus, and other insect-borne human diseases among both the military and civil populations. Now, typically when an animal consumes food having DDT residue, the DDT accumulates in the tissue of the animal by a process called bioaccumulation. Now, bioaccumulation is defined as the net of accumulation of a contaminant in or an organism from all sources, including water, air, and diet. Now, bioaccumulation is also a process of accumulation of chemicals in an organism that takes place if the rate of intake exceeds the rate of excretion. So, chemicals are introduced into the organism through the exposure to the abiotic environment, that is soil, water, air, or as a dietary intake. So, bioaccumulation is the gradual accumulation of substance such as pesticides or other chemicals in an organism. Therefore, the longer the biological half-life of a toxic substance, the greater the risk of chronic poisoning, even if environmental levels of the toxins are not very high. So, how is that the animals are being affected by this bioaccumulation? Now, red tides produce toxic organic chemicals that can affect organisms such as clams, mussels, and oysters, and also through this food chain, we humans are also at the ultimate receiving end. Now, as I had discussed the contributions of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, what the book sparked the modern environmental movement in the 1960s is particularly because it has brought a growing concerns or a kind of awareness in terms of bringing out the very essence of environmental concerns at that point of time. Now, As I had mentioned that the post 1960s people became more aware about the environmental issues such as air and water pollution, radiation, pesticide poisoning, as we had discussed in the context of how DDT and bioaccumulations are harmful to the organisms and also human. So they demanded the federal government to take more responsibility, okay, in terms of how the very notions of environmental issues should be taken. Now, they also developed a more sweeping critique of government and society, and Silent Spring, Russell Kerson's Silent Spring had exposed a collusion between industry and government in promoting and protecting the chemical industry and corporations more generally to the detriment of human well-being. So this critical view of government was reinforced by the civil rights and anti-war movement, and which led to a greater tendency to suspect that there was something fundamentally wrong with the American government and American society as a whole. Therefore, this particular book has received a wider or greater recognitions of the direct relationship between environmental and social issues, and a significant number of nature writers, philosophers have actually taken a critique of the growing environmental problems. Now, one can also see that one of the main impact of Kerson's Silent Spring was that there was a public concern for the environment, and which became pretty much clear during the Earth Day demonstrations of the 1970. Now, why is that the Earth Day that is of 1970 important? It is the largest environmental movement in history, and on 22nd April 1970, more than 20 million people took to the streets across the United States to protest environmental destruction. And the nation has witnessed, during that point of time, the devastating impacts of the Santa Barbara oil spill, and seen the first photographs of the Earth taken by astronauts. So the beauty of that blue marble picture from space contrasted bleakly with the lamentable state of the Earth and that they knew from the ground. And also the polluted river caught fire on several occasions between 1936 and 1969, and when debris and oil had concentrated on the water surface and ignited. So a blaze in 1969 came at a time of increasing environmental awareness and symbolized years of environmental neglect. As amended in 1972, the law became commonly known as the Clean Water Act. Now, the new environmentalism, that is in response to the environmental movement, several laws emerged to regulate the environmental pollution and protect the natural resources. So some of the important laws that determine how the Mississippi River is managed are the National Environmental Policy Act, NEPA of 1969. So as I had pointed out that this particular act, as a result of the polluted river which caught fire and which was set ablaze and in 1969 was amended again in 1972 and which eventually became the Clean Water Act. So the Clean Water Act is the primary federal law in the United States governing water pollution. Its objective is to restore and maintain the chemical, physical and biological integrity of the nation's waters, which recognizes the responsibilities of the states in addressing pollution and providing assistance to the states to do so, and then which include funding for publicly owned treatment works for the improvement of wastewater treatment and maintaining the integrity of the wetlands. Now, post 1972, because after the passing of these laws which concerns regulations of the environmental pollutions, the 1972 amendments have actually focuses to establish the basic structures for regulating pollutant discharges into the waters of the United States, and also maintain the existing requirements to set water quality standards for all contaminants in surface waters. And it also made it unlawful for any person to discharge any pollutant from a point source into navigable waters unless a permit was obtained under its provisions. Now, it also funded the construction of sewage treatment plants under the construction grants program, and it also recognized the need for planning to address the critical problems posed by a non-point source pollution. Now, this perhaps speaks volumes about the national environmental policy, which I quote, "The purpose of these acts are to declare a national policy which will encourage productive and enjoyable harmony between man and his environment, and to promote efforts which will prevent or eliminate damage to the environment and biosphere, and stimulate the health and welfare of man, to enrich the understanding of the ecological systems and natural resources important to the nation, and to establish a council on environmental quality." Now, the Federal Water Pollution Control Act of 1972 again is important because it was the first major US law to address water pollution, as I had already discussed, and the Clean Water Act, which established the basic structure for regulating the discharges. Now, why is the Clean Water Act important? Now, if you look at the way in which when the US Congress passed the Clean Water Act in 1972, it intended to protect and maintain the chemical, physical and biological integrity of the nation's waters. The act was effective not only improving the quality of the nation's water, but also in slowing the rate of flows of the wetlands, and most important to the waterfowl and other wildlife. So one can really look at whether the Clean Water Act was effective or not. To some extent, the Clean Water Act has been successful at reducing pollution, and one can also like identify the sources of pollutions like the wastewater treatment plants and factories. Now, however, the non-point source pollutions is considered to be still a significant problem for the clean water. Now, if you look at the post 1960s, that is the emergence of the new environmental movement, it led to the increase in scientific understanding, that is more research publications are being engaged. I mean, the research were being done extensively, and then publications were carried out, and also increase in the pressure group memberships of like the non-governmental organizations like the Greenpeace, Amnesty, and the World Wildlife Fund. And it also increased science of damage, that is how flooding, oil spills, acid rain are being brought under the realm of the environmental concerns. And it also increased the desire to find solutions, which is very much important, and it led to a wider media attentions, and also the public interests are on the rise. Now, if you look at the kind of influences it has looked at, I had already pointed out that different legislations and policies were being framed as a result of the wider pressures from the citizens, and even the many of the writers and academics. Now, one can perhaps again look at some of the driving forces in terms of steering the new environmental movement. Now, Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, I have already detailed about this, so I need not explain this further. But the economics of the coming spaceship art by Kenneth Ewart Boulding is again important, and Kenneth Ewart Boulding was an English-born American economist. So, for the first time, perhaps environment has been, or ecology has been linked with economics. Now, following the publications of Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, the developing environmental movement drew attention to the relationship between economic growth and development and environmental degradation. Now, what does the work of Kenneth Boulding is important, because most often Boulding's work is cited as being foundational to understanding of how the economy interacts with the environment, and particularly of relevance to the ecological economist. One of the main reference made in this regard to his seminal work is that the very usage of the metaphor of planet Earth as spaceship. So, in his particular essays which he has published and related work, he placed both within the historical context of environmental movement and developments in the thought on environment economy interactions. Now, what does Boulding's metaphorical use of spaceship art mean? Spaceship art is nothing but it is a worldview encouraging everyone on this planet Earth to act as a harmonious crew working toward the greater good. Now, and this particular metaphor, which is coined by Boulding, that is the spaceship Earth, in some sense described about the our planet Earth, and he felt that all human beings are mere passengers on the spaceship Earth, and like the crew in a large ship, people had to put their heads together, work together in order to keep the planet, in order to function it effectively or properly. Now, what then again for us, for this particular, for us to have an idea about Boulding's work, again that the space, what is exactly the spaceship economy? So, the closed economy of the future might similarly be called the spaceman economy, in which the Earth has become a single spaceship without unlimited reservoirs of anything, either for extraction or for pollution, and in which therefore man must find his place in a cyclical ecological system which is capable of a continuous reproduction of material from, even though it cannot escape having inputs of energy. Now, the third one, that is Paul Ehrlich's population bomb, again is a significant contributions to this emergence of this new environmentalism. Now, in Paul Ehrlich is a Nobel Prize winning German Jewish physician and scientist who works in the fields of hematology, immunology, and also antimicrobial chemotherapy. Now, the population bomb, which is written by Paul and Annie Ehrlich, but which is solely credited to Paul, has been one of the best seller, and in this particular book, Paul Ehrlich argued that environmental crisis of the past decade could be traced to a single cause, that is overpopulation. Okay. Now, it was a simple number games, that is the Earth had too many people and too few resources to support them. So, as you can see in the slide, which is quoted from the Michigan Daily about the population growth way back in 1969, and it reads in 6000 BC the population was merely 5 million, and in 1650 AD it was 500 million. In 1850 it hit 1 billion. In 1930 it made 2 billion. In 1975 it will be 4 billion. So, if nothing interferes with this rate, it would reach 60 million billion by 2400, putting 100 people on every square yard of the Earth's surface, land and sea. The point is, something will interfere. If we don't, nature will. So, our ecosystem can't support our way of life. Is something which you can see in the daily Michigan newspaper. So, in this particular works, that is the population bomb, Ehrlich in fact warned of the perils of overpopulation and eventually which will lead to mass starvation, societal upheaval and environmental deterioration. So, Ehrlich warned that attempts to stretch the Earth's resources to support the population would result in mass starvations or epidemics, and ultimately which will lead to the breakdown of a social order. And he saw that population control as the only solution to the problems, because the birth rate must be brought into balance with the death rate, or mankind will breed itself into oblivion. So, given the severity of this threat, he argued the US government should incentivize having fewer children and improve access to birth control and abortion. He recommended that the US also encourage population control in developing countries where birth rates were highest, by making population control measures a conditions of foreign aid. So therefore, the population bomb, which is co-authored with his wife Annie L. Rich, in some sense predicted hundreds of millions of people are going to starve to death, and in the 1970s, like a fate that was awaited by green revolution in intensive agriculture. Now, what is the main thesis or theory which is being outlined in Eldridge in his book or in his work, The Population Bomb? Now, Eldridge has dealt with virtually every sort of ecological crisis, from declining biodiversity to habitat destruction, deforestation, nuclear waste, and the ozone hole and the greenhouse effect. Now, the 1970s again is something which has led to the emergence of many frontal organizations, particularly the non-government organizations. As we had already discussed, the first Earth Day, which was celebrated in 1970, and it also led to the Greenpeace of 1971 and the Polluter's Pay Principles, OECD of 1970. So these are some of the the important parameters or the important events which took place in the 1970s. And in the 1970s also, one can look to the limits of the growth debate, and the Club of Rome report in 1972 came with two important conclusions. That is, if the present trends in growth of population, industrializations, pollutions, food production and resource depletion continue unchanged, the limits to growth on this planet would be reached within the next 100 years. So in some sense, you could also link this with the works of Paul Eldridge, The Population Bomb. And another conclusions which was passed in the Club of Rome report in 1972 was, it is also possible to alter these growth trends and to establish a condition of ecological and economic stability that is sustainable for the future. So these are some of the again ecological disasters which was witnessed. And over here, the third one, that is the Polluter's Pay Principles, OECD in 1971. Now, what does this particular recommendations talks about? It in some sense outlines that the Polluter's Pays principle means that the polluter should bear the cost of pollution prevention and controlled measures, and the latter being measures decided by public authorities to ensure that the environment is in an acceptable state. So in other words, the polluter has to bear the course of steps that he is legally bound to take to protect the environment, such as measures to reduce the pollutant emissions at source and measures to avoid pollution by collective treatment of effluent from polluting installations and other sources of pollution. The polluter's pays principle is the commonly accepted practice that those who produce pollution should actually bear the cost of managing it to prevent damage to such as like human health or the environment. Now, for instance, a factory that produces potentially poisonous substance as a byproduct of its activities is usually held responsible for its safe disposal. Disposing of the effluents or should be in a better safe or positioned. So the polluter's pay principles is part of a set of broader principles to guide sustainable development worldwide, which was formerly known as the 1992 Rio Declaration. Now, some of the environmental crisis which was witnessed in the late 1960s, because during the late 1960s an environmental crisis took shape as a series of environmental catastrophe and which of course led to transform the American environmental consciousness. Now, some of the soon after the crisis took its final form, that is several immensely popular books which we have discussed, that is Rachel Carson's Silent Spring and Paul Ehrlich's The Population Bombed, and several others which have actually were pretty much instrumental in terms of creating some kind of environmental concerns and awareness. Now, one of the ideas which was posited, that is the environmental crisis which was witnessed in the post or the late 1960s, are that the smoke in Los Angeles and New York City, that is nearly 100 million vehicles filled American roads by 1970, and also producing more than half of the country's emissions of hydrocarbons and carbon monoxide. Now, in the 1960s, the US did not have strong air quality standards, or maybe the emissions of automobiles and industries polluted the air, sometime even resulting to a deadly smoke. And smoke occurs when the compounds that vehicles, power plants and factories emit certain kinds of create problems to the atmosphere. And the second one is the Santa Barbara disaster, that is the episode which received a massive and national and media coverage, and there was an increasing outrages of the incident. Now, one can perhaps also look at how a new environmentalism or a new worldview has emerges. Now, as pointed out, and from our discussions from some of the books written by some of the noted environmentalists, conservationists and economists, how they try to link the environment with economy, and then so on and so forth. Now, nature writers and environmental philosophers began to analyze more closely the fundamental values and worldviews which are at works in American culture's view of nature, and also starting with Aldous Leopold's land ethics and Lynn White ecological crisis. Now, we have already looked at what sustainable development is in the introductory session, so we need not go to this. So these are some of the again disasters which can be perhaps looked at in the 1980s. The Bhopal gas tragedy, as we all know, where thousands of people were dead, and then the cases has continued for a long duration or period of time. And the rise of green powers in the 80s, that is environmental groups which with the increasing membership from not just within the UK but also across different parts of the world. And it also led to the Art Summit of 1992, and wherein the 5 agreements were introduced, that is the framework conventions of climate change and the convention on biodiversity, more importantly the Rio declarations. So 1990s, you could see how the focus and then the changes which has led to, that is sustainable development has also actually being it has evolved, and with the sustainable development goals at different summit and places. Now, we can in some sense sum up our discussions by saying that the 1960s have actually witnessed or gave birth to a kind of new consciousness, movements and groups which are no longer confined to a particular single country, but also across different countries in the globe, because people join hands with, like for example, the Greenpeace movement and so on and so forth. So the 70s again also look to the kind of battle or maybe tense argument which has been seen across discipline, that is the economies and environmental movement. And environment was not something which is confined or limited to only the ecologists or environmentalists, but also by several other disciplines. The 80s again introduced the SD, that is sustainable development, and so on and so forth. So climate change, of course, is again one very overarching and main issue which is very much part of in the in the 21st century. So we'll continue with the northern environmentalism or environmental movement in the north, and also environmental movement in the global south in our next class. Thank you.